Well, good morning again. We'll make a start. Once again, my name's Robert Speed. I'm the project director for water quality at the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. And with me is my colleague Sarah Castine, who's a project manager, also working on the Reef Trust Partnership. Firstly, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join the call. As I noted to some of you earlier, all of our other attendees are muted, so you're all on mute, which we've had to do just because of a large number of people who have joined this webinar. You'll see that there's a chat function and also a questions function. We've already checked with a few of the early arrivers. It seemed that the sound quality and things were okay, but if you're having any issues, do please send through a message. In terms of questions, primarily we'll look to address those at the end. I've got a list of all the questions that were emailed through as of about 10 minutes ago that had come through to the grants email address at GBRF, and so I'll work through those either through the presentation at the appropriate time or otherwise at the end. But for others, if you have any questions, please send them through as soon as you can, just using the questions function on the webinar. Please don't email them through now. We don't have access to those directly, but as I say, we got any that were emailed through up to probably about 10 minutes ago. So the structure of the morning is pretty simple. I've just got a brief presentation here. There's about 20 slides, and we'll step you through some of the context and the key aspects of the grant guidelines. I can then talk through and respond to the questions that have already come through. And if there are any other further questions, then, as I say, please send them through using the questions function. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the overall context, but just very briefly, of course, this grant program falls under the Reef Trust Partnership, which has been created through an agreement between the Australian Government and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. It's a 6-year program with a total funding of around $443 million. The full grant agreement is available online at the Department of Environment and Energy website for those of you that are interested in seeing all of the details of it. But I've captured here a few of the key aspects. So the objective, the overall objective of the Reef Trust Partnership is to achieve significant measurable improvement in the health of the reef over the life of the partnership, and outcomes are framed around 3 themes. Firstly, improved management of the reef. Secondly is protection of the values of the reef. And thirdly is managing the key threats to the reef, including water quality. There are 5 components under the Reef Trust Partnership, and so the funding pools are defined in the overarching grant agreement. And so that includes $201 million towards water quality improvement activities, and then other funding towards crown of thorns starfish, reef restoration, adaptation science, Indigenous and community engagement, and integrated monitoring and reporting activities. The water quality component, which obviously is the focus of our discussion today, it has the purpose of addressing water quality improvement targets that are impacting the reef, and the grant agreement recognises specifically the need for activities to do things like improving farming practices, reducing fertiliser use, encouraging the uptake of new technologies, and the uptake of different land management practices. The water quality work is designed to build on and to accelerate existing efforts that are required to achieve the water quality targets and outcomes in the Reef 2050 plan and the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan. And so they really are the key overarching documents for the Reef Trust Partnership as a whole in the case of the Reef 2050 plan, and then specifically for the water quality component, it is the water quality targets and outcomes, most specifically in the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, but also more broadly the other targets that are set out in that plan. The key mines under the Reef Trust Partnership set out there. So by the end of this year, 24th of December, the investment strategy for the whole Reef Trust Partnership is to be submitted to the department. So that will include the investment strategy for the water quality component. The monitoring and evaluation plan for the partnership is due in March next year, and the first annual work plan is due in June next year. All of the major milestone documents under the grant agreement are made available on the GBRF website a few weeks after they are submitted to the Department of Environment. So that means, for example, the investment strategy will be available in early January for public viewing. There are, of course, a number of other documents that are already available online on the website from earlier milestones for those that are interested. In terms of the water quality planning process and how we are determining where investments are likely to be made, the investment strategy, which, as I say, is due at the end of this year, it will describe a high-level approach. It will include some principles and some key areas of focus, not geographic areas, but more, I guess, thematic areas that the partnership is likely to focus on and to prioritise. However, the more detailed description of where funding is likely to be directed and how funding is going to be directed will come in the annual work plans. I'll just re-emphasise that point, that the investment strategy is very high level. So when it comes out, it will give you a reader some ideas as to obviously the direction that the partnership is taking, but the real detail about where funding will be on the ground will not be available until the annual work plans come out, or at least certainly closer to the annual work plans coming out. There's a significant amount of work, as you would imagine, going into determining how we would invest funds. And there are probably two components to that to mention. The first is that the Foundation has commissioned Alluvium Consulting to develop an investment tool to help us better understand the costs and benefits associated with different intervention options. Many of you will be aware that Alluvium undertook an exercise in 2016, referred to as a Reef costings process, where they estimated the total cost of meeting all of the then water quality targets. This consultancy builds on that work, takes, I guess, the engine of that original modelling process and has updated it with the best available information we have around current costs and efficacy of different intervention types, also incorporating the more recent water quality targets, expanding it to capture more greater granularity at a spatial scale, and so on. And ultimately, that'll provide a tool that we have and that we'd like to think will be ultimately be available to the broader Reef community to use in understanding what different investment scenarios might mean in terms of cost and water quality outcomes. That's obviously a very technical process, and in parallel to that, we're running a separate values-based process to try and understand what are the values and objectives that I guess a broad range of stakeholders feel are important, and which will be then used to underpin the decision-making process. As I say, that's a process that's ongoing and that will run over the next few months, and on the back of that, we will look to build on the investment strategy and to ultimately release the first annual work plan, which will more specifically identify where funding is going to be and how that funding is going to be targeted in the first year of major project implementation, so starting from 1 July 2019. So the process for granting for those subsequent grants that will fall out of the investment strategy and out of the annual work plans is yet to be determined. So now to come to the specifics of this Stage 1 grant program that we're talking about today. So the context here as you will have read in the grant guidelines, is that we recognise that there will be significant on-ground resources that will be necessary to deliver the water quality component. We also recognise and have been told everywhere we have gone, everyone we've spoken to, that delivery capacity is a significant potential barrier to implementation, that there are capacity constraints, and that we need to be mindful of that. And as a consequence, we recognise that there's a need to build up that capacity, and also at the same time that there's a risk that existing capacity could be lost as current programs finish, and in the absence of other funding available to maintain those resources. The other important element to note is that we recognise that there is sufficient information already available for us to understand where the highest priority threats are, and the highest priority regions for interventions. So obviously the investment strategy and the other work we're doing is critical to informing investment in the overall $200 million water quality component, but there is sufficient information available for us to know that this is an important issue, this issue of capacity, and that there are key areas that we need to be focusing on it, and hence the moving ahead with this first stage of funding. So the priority for it of this stage is then to maintain the momentum that currently exists to ensure that we continue on with and keep that continuity, and to build on existing programs. And it really is about laying the foundations for future work, recognising what we'll need down the track, and with this singular focus on maintaining or building delivery capacity. It's obviously emphasised in a number of places, but I just stress it here again. We will come back to again in the assessment criteria, but that really underpins all of the other criteria. The final priority there is to build on prior investments that have demonstrated success. And again, well, I'll come to that again when we speak about the specific assessment criteria, but it will be important that all applications show how the methods that they're putting forward have already been demonstrated to be successful. So this grant round is very much about funding tried and true methods. The partnership as a whole will be very supportive of and has placed a high priority on more innovative measures, and certainly they will be highlighted. That will be highlighted in the investment strategy when it comes out, and there will be, I expect, significant opportunities for funding for more innovative ideas down the track. But for this specific grant round, it's very much about tried and true measures. So in summary, there is a $20 million pool available. We've set a minimum funding amount of $500 million for any proposal. One of the questions came in, queried why there was a minimum amount, and really it's a question of scale. It's recognising that, you know, for the resources we've got and what we're trying to achieve here, that we need measures that are being implemented at sufficient scale to make a significant material difference, and so that's really the rationale around the minimum amount that has been sent there. There is scope for applicants to submit more than one application. There are the criteria here, which are really sort of pass or fail tests. They're not assessment criteria as such, but they're simply pass or fail. If you don't meet these, then applications won't be considered. So they need to be targeting the primary pollutants as identified in the scientific consensus statement. Projects need to be ready to commence by March 2019. We recognise that there may then be a mobilisation or planning phase that sort of follows from March, so we don't necessarily expect that there are boots on the ground on the 1st of March or people out planting trees on the 1st of March, and we are open to as I say, a mobilisation phase of, you know, a few months through there, but certainly we would expect that activities would be underway probably by June 2019 or thereabouts. Came in whether funding could be used for a project that was solely focused in 2020, so starting in January 2020. I think the answer to that would be no. Coming down to the last bullet point there about time criticality, the idea of this grant is about funding those activities where we think there are significant benefits that we lost if the project is delayed. Hence, and I guess that links to this idea that they need to be able to commence within by March 2019 or soon after. For activities that are not planned until year 2020, then we would expect that prior to then there will have been a further funding round that will have come out that would have provided opportunities for those sorts of projects. And then the final criteria there is funding for projects for up to 2 years. So that's certainly all that we will be committing under this phase. We are certainly would be interested to see in proposals to the extent that you might like to highlight the capacity for scaling up or for extending beyond that period to identify what that might look like. So certainly we would be interested in seeing how a 1 to 2 year project could grow over time and how it might be supported by subsequent funding rounds. So I'd encourage you to include that sort of information if that's relevant to your proposal, not at the same level of detail presumably, but certainly to highlight that potential. Okay. In terms of ineligible activities, there's a number that are identified there in the guidelines. I haven't listed them all here. I'd suggest you read them carefully, but they include actions that commenced prior to the grant. Obviously, we will be interested in funding things that are on previous projects and funding extensions of those, but this is excluding payment for work that has already been done and that is ongoing, and certainly any payments for retrospective payments are excluded. On-ground activities outside the reef catchment are ineligible. Any applications for activities that are already being funded elsewhere, where there might be a duplication of funding, are excluded. Similarly, their funding is not available under this round for the purchase of equipment or for capital items. We recognise in the guidelines that there could be some incidental capital items that are purchased, but certainly that should not be the focus of the activity. I note that we had one question was asking specifically around funding for equipment upgrades, and I know there have been previous Reef Trust grants that have funded fertiliser boxes or spray canopies or other sorts of farming equipment. So that sort of activity is not eligible for funding under this grant round. A further one to note, and we had a question on this, which is around the exclusion of activities that are designed to enable a farm or other business to comply with their obligations under the reef regulations. To clarify what this provides for, this precludes any specific actions that would allow a land manager to directly comply with the regulations. So, for example, be ineligible to pay a farmer to use the regulated rate of fertiliser. So it's ineligible to be using funds simply to pay for somebody to comply with the law. However, enabling actions are not captured. So this grant funding is still available for things that will ultimately enable somebody to comply with the regulation. So, for example, by encouraging farmers to adopt BMP, providing extension, training or agronomy services. So those sort of activities are certainly still eligible. We had, as I say, we had a question that came through specifically around the, I guess, the moving nature of the reef regulations and the fact that they are, that there is potentially changes coming here. I think ultimately the grant funding requirements, as set out on the slide there and as I've just described, I think they will apply to whatever the regulations are at the time. So, I mean, I think it would be wise probably to assume, well, I wouldn't plan on a project that would be non-compliant with the new Reef regulations. But in any case, I think the key message here is that there is certainly scope still to do work that works with farmers around encouraging them to go into things like BMP and extension. So I don't think that the restriction here should be too limiting in many cases, at least. Just to quickly step through the specific assessment criteria. So there are a number that are mandatory, and what that means is that in the assessment process, if there's not a sort of a minimum threshold met, then the application will be considered ineligible and won't be considered any further. So the first of those criteria is around the location and the focus, and the requirement is that that activities or projects are in very high or moderate priority areas, as defined in the Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan, and relative to the particular target. So it needs to be a very high or moderate priority area for that particular target. And there's a snapshot there from the Water Quality Improvement Plan. I'm sure you, all those on the phone, are familiar with it and how it works. If you have any specific questions, then do please email them through. The second criteria, again mandatory, is that the application needs to focused on maintaining or building existing on-ground delivery capacity and capability. That's the point that we've already touched on, and there are some specifics there, so including agricultural extension and agronomic services, land manager engagement to encourage stewardship, or catchment restoration to decrease erosion. Assessment criteria 3 is that the approach needs to be delivered by existing providers implementing a proven approach. So it needs to consolidate or build on previous reef protection initiatives that are ongoing or have been completed, preferably by the proponent, but that is not essential. What is essential, though, is that the method itself needs to be proven. It needs to have a demonstrated success in achieving progress towards improved water quality outcomes. And I would just stress again that the bar on this particular item will be set quite high. We will be looking for proposals to show real progress towards water quality outcomes on the pathway at the very least, and support it as best we can by quantitative evidence, by independent assessments and so on. We will be, to the extent we can, talking to the original investors in previous projects to understand their views on those projects. So I just make applicants aware of that. The final point there is that the approach needs to be conducted by an organisation with strong organisational capacity and capability. So it's really just, I guess, a self-evident requirement. We did have a question come in around to what extent does the grant accommodate new players outside existing projects. As I said there, we're not excluding them. There's obviously a competitive advantage for an organisation that has already been doing work on the ground in these regions and has a proven track record. But certainly we're not excluding new players coming in to the region. What we are excluding is new ideas that haven't been tested and haven't been shown to be successful. Again, I'd emphasise that new approaches and innovative approaches are a very high priority for the Reef Trust Partnership, but they're not captured under this grant round. The Assessment criteria 4, again, a mandatory requirement, is that the project must include measurable outcomes. And so what we're saying here is that as part of your proposal, you need to demonstrate how you will be tracking success, how you will be demonstrating that the activity that's been implemented can be measured using meaningful indicators that show that we are on a pathway to improve water quality. Again, it's a mandatory criteria. We'll be looking for some very clear, meaningful indicators that can be captured. The final two criteria, these are both desirable. So that means they are given a weighting, and all the weightings for each of these criteria are set out in the guidelines. I haven't included them here again. So it means these are weighted, and each application will receive a score against them. But they are only desirable, which means if they score 0, you get no points, but the application is still eligible. So, for example, a proposal that has no other funding sources or co-investment is still eligible, but it will just have to compete against those that might score better on this particular criteria. So the two criteria here, one is the one around leveraging of additional funds, and then the second is about drawing in collaboration with technical expertise, and also collaborating or integrating with other projects. On the technical expertise, I guess that's emphasising that we want to, the preference for seeing, best available science being brought into these projects. In terms of the process and timeframes, the grant application form is obviously available in the tender pack on tenders.net. I assume that all of you, or the vast majority of you, have been there and downloaded the material. So there's the grant guidelines, there's an application form, which is in Word, so that you can just edit directly within it. And again, there's a specific question that we were asked around within the application form. There are, in section 4.1, there are other criteria set out with a box underneath each one. That is for the applicant to complete. That's not there for the assessment panel, that is there for the applicant. So we'd ask you, in preparing your application, to complete all of the other details, describing the project, and then when you come to the criteria, to include under each of the criteria a description of how it is, why it is that you consider that your application meets each of those criteria. Applications close on 11:45 at night on the 10th of December. We are aiming to announce the successful applicants in early February, which would mean that we would be hopefully advising successful applicants sometime during January. Oh, I should have mentioned as well, on the in the tender pack, of course, there is the contract. So the grant terms, it is in, you'll note on it, it is in draft form, but I think it's a close to final draft, I suspect, but in any case, that is available there also for your information. A final slide just to touch on probity issues. Obviously, the Foundation is very keen to uphold the highest standards of probity in undertaking this process, and included in that is to ensure that all applicants have fair and equitable opportunity to access the same information and consistent information. And so, with this in mind, there is a single point of contact for the grant program. That's set out there on the slide, and it's also included in the grant guidelines. It's the email that you all have now in any case. So after this session, please send any questions through directly to that grants@barrierreef.org email. Won't be able to have any conversations around this particular process while the tender is open. Neither will others within the Foundation. So please just divert your questions directly to that email address. All the questions from this session as well as any further questions that get emailed in over the coming weeks, will be posted. They'll be de-identified and summarised and posted on tenders.net together with an answer. And if you haven't done already, then please register on tenders.net, and there's a box there that you tick to be kept up to date on any changes, and that will then notify you if there are any further questions that have been loaded, or if there have been any changes for some reason or other to the grant guidelines or to other material.